The night was colder than she remembered. As she stepped out of the car, the city lights stretched before her, glittering like scattered diamonds against the darkness. She had told herself she would never come back. She had sworn it. But here she was, standing at the edge of a life she had abandoned. A past she had tried to erase. The doorman barely glanced at her as she walked toward the towering glass building. He didn't recognize her. That was a good thing. It had been years after all. Still, her heart pounded as she stepped into the lobby. The soft hum of quiet conversations, the faint scent of expensive cologne and polished wood, it was all the same. Nothing had changed. But she had. She kept her head down as she approached the front desk. The woman behind it barely looked up. "Do you have an appointment?" She swallowed, forcing her voice to stay steady. "I need to see him." The receptionist finally glanced up, giving her a once-over. There was no recognition in her expression, only polite disinterest. "Mr. Sinclair doesn't take walk-ins. If you'd like to schedule, he'll want to see me," she interrupted. Her voice sharper than intended. The receptionist sighed. "And you are," she hesitated, knowing the name alone would shift the entire room. Finally, she spoke. "His fiancée." The woman's eyebrows shot up. She wasn't the only one who had heard. A few people nearby turned their heads. A nervous tension filled the space, an unspoken question hanging in the air. Everyone in this building knew the story, the woman who had disappeared without a trace, the engagement that had been front-page news. The billionaire left behind, with no explanation, no closure. The receptionist cleared her throat, clearly uncertain of what to do next. "One moment, please." She picked up the phone, murmuring something too quietly to hear. A long pause followed, then a sharp nod. "You can go up." She forced herself to move toward the elevator, her legs unsteady beneath her. As the doors slid shut, she let out a shaky breath. She had imagined this moment 100 times, maybe more. But now that she was here, she wasn't sure if she could go through with it. The elevator climbed higher and higher, the numbers flashing too quickly. Every second felt like a countdown. When the doors finally opened, she stepped into a space that was both familiar and foreign. The office was massive, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. Everything was sleek, modern, impossibly expensive, and then she saw him standing by the window, his back to her, hands in his pockets. For a moment she couldn't breathe. Then he turned, their eyes met, and time stopped. He looked the same. Almost. But there was something colder in his gaze now. Something guarded. Neither of them spoke. She had imagined this reunion 100 different ways. But not like this, not with so much distance between them. Even as they stood only feet apart, finally, he broke the silence. "You're back." His voice was unreadable, and that terrified her. She nodded, her throat tight. "I am." A beat of silence. Why? She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. She had expected anger, hatred maybe. But this quiet, controlled stillness. "It was worse. I had to," she said softly. "I didn't have a choice." His expression didn't change. "You had a choice." When you left, the words cut deep. But she didn't flinch. She had expected that. Still, nothing could have prepared her for the weight of his stare. The way he was looking at her, as if she were a stranger. She took a step closer. "I know you have questions. I'll answer them. All of them. But first, I need you to listen." His jaw tightened, but he didn't stop her. She took a shaky breath, and then she said the words that would change everything. "The reason I left. It wasn't what you think." A flicker of something crossed his face. Doubt. Hesitation. She forced herself to go on. "I didn't betray you. I didn't lie to you. But I had to leave because if I hadn't..." She hesitated, her pulse hammering. "You wouldn't be standing here right now." He didn't move, didn't blink. But something in the room shifted. A slow realization settled between them. She wasn't just back. She was back with a secret that could change everything. She watched his expression carefully, searching for some sign of understanding, some reaction to the weight of her words. But he remained unreadable, his features as controlled as ever. The silence between them stretched, thick with tension. Finally, he spoke, his voice measured but cold. "You expect me to believe that?" She swallowed hard, bracing herself. "I know how it sounds." He let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "Do you?" He took a step closer, his gaze sharp, cutting through her like glass. "Because from where I'm standing, you disappeared without a trace. No warning, no explanation. One day we were planning a wedding, and the next, you were gone." His jaw tightened. "And now, after all these years, you suddenly show up with some cryptic excuse. You're going to have to do better than that." Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. She had expected this. She had prepared for it. But knowing didn't make it any easier. "I didn't have a choice," she said again, quieter this time. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "You keep saying that. But you're not saying anything else." Because she couldn't. Not yet. Not like this. She took a deep breath. "I need you to trust me." His expression darkened. "Trust you?" A bitter edge crept into his tone. "You lost that privilege the second you walked away." The words hit harder than she expected, but she didn't flinch. "I know. And I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need you to hear me out." For a moment, she thought he might refuse. That he might turn around, walk away, leave her standing there, just like she had left him all those years ago. But instead, he stared at her, as if trying to decide whether she was worth the effort. Then finally, he nodded. "Start talking." She let out a slow breath, steadying herself. "It wasn't safe," she said carefully. "For you. For me. For us." His eyes narrowed. Safe from what? She hesitated. How much could she tell him? How much could he handle right now? "There were people," she said finally. "People who didn't want us together. People who would have done anything to stop the wedding." His gaze flickered with something doubt, suspicion, maybe even something deeper. "Who?" She shook her head. "I can't say yet." A muscle in his jaw twitched. "Of course you can't." "I'm serious," she said, her voice firmer now. "If I tell you everything now, you won't be safe." He let out a slow, measured breath. "So let me get this straight. You left me, disappeared without a word, because you thought I was in danger?" She nodded. "And instead of coming to me, instead of trusting me to handle it, you just ran?" The accusation stung. "I did what I had to do." His eyes darkened. "No, you did what you thought was best. And you didn't even give me a choice." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Because he was right. She had made the decision for both of them. And now, standing here, she had to live with the consequences of that choice. A long silence stretched between them. Then he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. Why now? She met his gaze. Because it's not over. Something in his expression shifted, a flicker of concern buried beneath his anger. "I thought if I left, if I disappeared, it would be enough," she admitted. "I thought they would let it go." She swallowed. "But they haven't." His eyes searched hers. "Who are you running from?" She hesitated again, then finally whispered, "I don't know anymore." The words hung between them, heavy and uncertain, and for the first time since she had walked back into his life, she saw something flicker in his expression. Not forgiveness, not trust, but something close to understanding. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. His stare lingered on her, filled with questions he didn't know if he wanted answers to. She had been gone for years, and now she was standing in front of him, claiming she had left to protect him from a danger she still couldn't name. He had built walls around himself since she left, forced himself to move on. But now, those walls were starting to crack. She took a slow breath. "I know this sounds unbelievable, but I wouldn't have come back if it wasn't necessary. If I didn't think you were still in danger." His expression hardened. "I don't need protection," she sighed, frustration creeping in. "This isn't about what you need. It's about what's happening, whether you want to believe it or not." He ran a hand over his jaw, stepping away as if distance would help clear his mind. She wasn't just someone from his past. She was the person who had shattered his trust, the person he had once planned to spend his life with. And now, she was standing here, acting like she still had some right to control the narrative. He turned back to her, his voice lower now. "If there's really a threat, tell me what we're dealing with." She hesitated, shifting on her feet. "It's not that simple," his patience thinned. "It never is with you." She flinched slightly at that, but recovered quickly. "I need you to trust me, trust." He let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "You're asking for something you threw away a long time ago." She clenched her jaw, willing herself to stay calm. "I understand that, but whether you trust me or not, you need to listen." He exhaled slowly, crossing his arms. "Fine. I'm listening." She glanced around, suddenly uneasy. The walls had ears in places like this. She could feel it, the way her skin prickled, the way every hair on her arms stood on edge. She stepped closer to him, lowering her voice. "Not here." His brows pulled together. "Why?" "Because they could be watching." His stomach tightened at the implication. It wasn't just paranoia. She looked genuinely afraid. And no matter how much he wanted to hate her for the past, he couldn't ignore that fear. "Where do you suggest we talk?" he asked, still cautious. She hesitated. "Somewhere private. Somewhere they can't reach us." He studied her, weighing his options. Every instinct told him to send her away, to refuse to play whatever game she was caught in. But there was something in her eyes, something real. And despite everything, despite the years, he knew her well enough to recognize when she was terrified. After a long pause, he exhaled. "Let's go." They left the office through a side exit, avoiding attention. The city pulsed around them, bright lights, honking horns, a world that hadn't stopped moving, even though theirs had just collided again. He led her toward his car. Unlocking it with a click, she hesitated before getting in. Glancing over her shoulder, "Something wrong?" he asked. Noticing the tension in her shoulders, she shook her head quickly, but he didn't buy it. She was checking for someone. Watching. Waiting. Once inside, he started the engine, the low hum filling the silence between them. "Where to?" She hesitated before finally saying, "Somewhere you trust." He didn't trust easily. Not anymore. But there was one place, his private estate outside the city, where no one could reach them unless he wanted them to. It wasn't just a home, it was a fortress. He nodded and pulled onto the road, navigating through the streets with practiced ease. The tension between them sat heavy, unspoken words hanging in the air. Finally, he broke the silence. "Start talking." She stared out the window, as if gathering her thoughts. "The people who came after us before, they never stopped watching." His grip on the steering wheel tightened. "And you know this how?" She glanced at him. "Because they found me." His jaw locked. "Who?" She looked away again. "I still don't know who's pulling the strings, but I know they've been waiting. Watching. And now that I'm back, it won't be long before they come for you too." He exhaled slowly. "Why now?" She hesitated. "Because something changed." He waited, but she didn't continue. "What changed?" he pressed. She turned to him, eyes dark with something between fear and determination. "They know something they didn't before. And it's only a matter of time before they act on it." His stomach clenched at the way she said it. There was something she wasn't telling him. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the truth. The drive was silent, except for the low hum of the engine. She kept glancing over her shoulder, her breath shallow, her fingers gripping the seatbelt tightly. He noticed the way her hands trembled, the way her eyes darted to every passing car, as if expecting someone to appear. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his patience wearing thin. "You need to stop doing that." "Doing what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, acting like they're right behind us. She exhaled, rubbing her hands together. Because they could be, he didn't like the way she said it. There was certainty in her voice, not paranoia. That was what unsettled him the most. Then tell me what I'm up against, he demanded. No more cryptic answers. She hesitated, then shook her head. It's not that simple. It never is with you, he muttered. A long silence followed. She kept looking at the road ahead, but he could see the struggle in her eyes, the war she was fighting within herself. Then finally she whispered, "There's something you need to know before we get there." His jaw clenched. "Then say it." She opened her mouth, then stopped. Her breath hitched, and she suddenly turned in her seat. "Turn left," she said urgently. His stomach tightened. Why just do it? The urgency in her voice made him react before thinking. He swerved onto the side street, his pulse spiking. The moment he did, she twisted in her seat again, peering through the rear windshield. His patience snapped. "What is going on there here?" she whispered. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. At first, there was nothing but the glow of streetlights. Then he saw it, a black SUV, turning onto the street behind them. Speeding up, his stomach dropped faster. She said he didn't argue. His foot pressed against the gas pedal, and the car surged forward. The SUV matched their speed. He cursed under his breath. "How long have they been following you?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But they're not going to stop." The SUV gained on them. His mind raced. He had security at his estate, but that wouldn't matter if they didn't make it there in one piece. He took a sharp right, tires screeching against the pavement. "Who are they?" "I don't know exactly," she said, her voice shaky. "But they're the reason I left." The weight of her words hit him, but he didn't have time to process it. The SUV was closing in. His heart pounded. He swerved into another turn, but the vehicle behind them didn't hesitate. It was locked onto them like a predator hunting its prey. "We won't make it like this," she said. "Then tell me what you suggest," he snapped. She looked ahead, thinking fast. Then she pointed. "That alley. Turn now." It was risky, but so was staying on the open road. He made the sharp turn, the tires skidding slightly. The alley was narrow, barely wide enough for his car. "Hold on," he warned. She braced herself. He accelerated, weaving through the tight space. The SUV hesitated at the entrance, and for a brief moment, he thought they had lost them. Then, the sound of tires screeching filled the air again. "They're coming," she whispered. His mind raced. They were running out of road. And he still didn't know the full truth. The alley was tighter than he expected, barely enough room to maneuver. The headlights of the SUV behind them cast long shadows on the damp walls, closing in like a predator. His grip tightened on the steering wheel, pulse hammering as he pushed the car forward. "They won't stop," she whispered. "I know." A split-second decision could make or break their escape. Ahead, the alley curved sharply to the right, but there was an opening, an old loading dock ramp leading up to a deserted warehouse. It was risky, but better than being cornered. "Hold on," he warned. She barely had time to react before he jerked the wheel, sending the car up the ramp. The vehicle jolted as it hit the incline, metal scraping against concrete. The SUV behind them hesitated for a moment, giving them the edge they needed. They crashed through a rusted metal barrier at the top, landing inside the darkened warehouse with a loud thud. The car skidded to a stop, the sound of their breathing, the only thing breaking the silence. She turned to him wide-eyed. "What now?" He scanned the space. The warehouse was vast, abandoned, filled with old crates and broken machinery. There was another exit on the far side, but it would take time to reach it. The SUV had found the ramp. "We run," he said, unbuckling his seatbelt. She nodded, understanding the urgency. They threw open the doors and sprinted through the maze of crates and steel beams. Behind them, the SUV's engine roared as it entered the warehouse, its headlights slicing through the darkness. They ducked behind a stack of wooden pallets, pressing their backs against the rough surface. Footsteps echoed. Doors slammed shut. They weren't just being followed. They were being hunted. "Stay quiet," he whispered. She nodded, trying to steady her breathing. The air was thick with dust, every inhale scratchy against her throat. He risked a glance around the corner. Shadows moved, figures dressed in dark clothing, sweeping the area with sharp precision. These weren't ordinary pursuers. They were trained. "Do you recognize them?" he whispered. She hesitated. "No, but they know me." A chill ran down his spine. They weren't after him. They were after her. "We need to keep moving." They crouched low, weaving between crates, keeping to the shadows. But the men were closing in, their movements too calculated then. Suddenly, a voice clear. Cold. "Too familiar, you can't run forever." She went rigid. He felt her entire body tense beside him, her breath catching in her throat. He turned to her. "Who is that?" Her eyes darted toward the sound. The footsteps grew louder, drawing closer. Her hands clenched into fists. "I should have told you sooner." She whispered the pieces were falling into place. But he still didn't know the full picture then. Before he could ask, she stepped out of the shadows straight into the light, his heart slammed against his ribs. What was she doing? The figures in the darkness stilled, their weapons lowering slightly, and then one of them stepped forward, a man. Tall, poised, exuding control, his gaze locked onto her. "It's been a long time." The man said. She didn't move, didn't blink, and then, in the coldest voice he had ever heard from her, she said, "Not long enough." His stomach dropped. She knew them. She had known them all along. The air inside the warehouse felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears as he watched her, standing there in the light, face to face, with the man she clearly knew, but had never mentioned. The man took a step closer, his gaze steady. "You disappeared, left everything behind, and now you come back?" His voice was controlled, but there was something dangerous beneath it, a sharp edge that sent a chill down his spine. She didn't flinch. "I didn't have a choice." He could see it now. This wasn't just about her running away. It wasn't just about secrets. This was deeper, older, and it was something she had never told him. The man's expression didn't change, but there was something in his stance, something in the way his hands flexed at his sides. "You always had a choice." Her jaw tightened. "Not if I wanted to survive." He wanted to step forward, wanted to pull her back to safety, but he couldn't move. Not yet. Not until he understood. The man let out a slow breath. "Then tell me, after all this time, why come back?" She hesitated, just for a second, and that was when he realized it. She had planned this. She hadn't just come back to hide. She had come back for something else. Her hands curled into fists. "Because I have something you want." The silence stretched between them, a tension so thick it felt like the walls were closing in. The man's expression remained unreadable, but he tilted his head slightly. "Is that so?" She took a slow step forward. "You were looking for something. Something you thought was lost." The man said nothing, but the flicker in his eyes told them everything. She exhaled sharply. "I know where it is." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down, everything hinging on her next words. The man's voice was low when he finally spoke. "You're bluffing." She shook her head. "Am I?" The air was razor sharp now, the kind of silence that came before something explosive. He could see it, feel it, the way the men behind the leader tensed, waiting for an order. The way her shoulders squared, determination burning in her eyes. She wasn't bluffing. And that changed everything. The man's lips pressed together. "You should have stayed gone." For the first time, she smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "That's what you were counting on, wasn't it?" Then, before anyone could react, she moved. Everything happened in a blur. She twisted, grabbing the nearest crate and shoving it toward the men, scattering them for just a second. That second was all they needed. Run, she yelled. He didn't hesitate. They sprinted toward the far exit, their footsteps echoing against the metal walls. Behind them, voices shouted, boots thundered against the floor. They burst through the door into the night, cold air hitting their faces like a shock. He grabbed her hand, pulling her forward. Where are we going? She barely looked at him. Somewhere they won't follow. He didn't ask how she knew that. Didn't question the certainty in her voice. Right now, all that mattered was getting out alive. The sound of engines roared behind them. The chase wasn't over, but something told him neither was the truth. The city lights blurred as they ran, the cold air biting at their skin. He could still hear the voices behind them, but they were fading, lost in the hum of traffic and distant sirens. She was gripping his hand tightly, leading him forward, her pace never slowing. He didn't know where they were going, only that they had to keep moving. They turned down a side street, ducking behind an old building. She pressed her back against the wall, breathing hard, eyes scanning the street. He watched her, waiting for answers. You knew, he said, his voice low. You knew who they were all along, she nodded slowly. I should have told you. Why didn't you? Her gaze flickered with something unreadable. Because I wasn't sure if telling you would keep you safe or put you in more danger. He let out a breath, shaking his head. That's not how this works. You don't get to decide that on your own. She looked down, her fingers tightening at her sides. I know a car passed by on the street, headlights sweeping over them for a brief second. She tensed, but it kept going. He could see her calculating, figuring out their next move. They won't stop. He said, I know. She finally met his eyes. There was something different now, something settled, like she had made up her mind about something. They were never looking for me, she said. Not really, he frowned. What do you mean? She hesitated, then reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, something she had kept hidden. When she opened her palm, he saw it, a flash drive. No bigger than a key. They were looking for this, she said. His stomach tightened. What's on it? The truth. He stared at it. Everything they had been through, everything they had been running from, it all came down to this. A tiny piece of plastic and metal. We can't just keep running, he said. She nodded. I know. A beat of silence stretched between them before she finally spoke again. There's someone I need to see. Who? She exhaled. Someone who can end this. He didn't question her. Not anymore. He just nodded. Let's go. They moved quickly, sticking to side streets, keeping their heads down. She led the way, her focus unshakable. He had never seen her like this before, not afraid, not unsure, just determined. Eventually, they reached a quiet residential area, far from the city center. She stopped in front of a house, hesitating for the first time. Then, before he could ask, she knocked. The door opened a moment later. An older man stood there, his face lined with years of experience, his sharp eyes scanning them both. When he saw her, something flickered in his expression. Recognition. You finally came back, the man said. She held up the flash drive. Because it's time. The man stepped aside, letting them in. Inside, the air was heavy with unspoken words. She handed the flash drive to the man, watching as he inserted it into a laptop. The screen lit up, files appearing one by one. He scanned them, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked at her. This changes everything. She nodded. I know. The man sat back, exhaling. Are you sure about this? Yes. He nodded slowly, then looked at him. And you? He hesitated for only a moment before answering. I'm with her. The man studied him for a second, then gave a small nod. Then you both need to be ready. She straightened. We are. He pressed a key on the laptop, and just like that, everything they had been running from was about to be exposed. The truth was no longer a secret. It was about to change everything. She turned to him, her expression softer now. Thank you. He shook his head. For what? For staying. He gave her a small smile. Always. Outside, the night stretched on, but for the first time in a long time, the running was over. The fight was just beginning, but at least now, they were fighting on their own terms. Together.